Welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I'm Douglas Peak, and I am your Salty Pastor. Our goal is to coach you up in your faith. We do this in numerous ways, but mostly I try to get you to think for yourself. I want to teach you critical thinking skills, and the best way to do that is by studying the Bible, particularly the New Testament. It's really interesting because I believe that when people come to know God and they put their faith in Jesus Christ, something happens in them spiritually. What happens in them is that they have a deeper and more honest love of what is true, and they want to seek that which is true. I was looking at a book just recently where the guy basically lays out an entire case, which is pretty strong, that without Christianity, there would be no science at all. And one of the basic premises of the book is that it's because when people become spiritually awake to God, God is a God of love, a God who's holy, and this by default means he is a God of truth, that which is true. So the more you grow your faith, the more mature you become, truth and your love of that which is true becomes even more apparent. And that's what I'm hoping to do, is coach you up in a love of truth and how to know it, embrace it, walk in it, and not believe false things, because what you believe is one of the most important things about you. So that's what the Salty Pastor is all about. That's why I'm here, and I hope that you find it beneficial. I hope you find it challenging, because I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. I just want to tell you what I believe God says is true. And we predominantly do that by looking into the scriptures and then applying them to modern day situations that we are going through. So that's what it's all about. I'm glad you're here with us on the Salty Pastor. And we've been talking recently about a very significant point, and that is, what is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament? In other words, why is the Old Testament a part of the Bible? And why is the New Testament books part of the Bible? And one of the reasons you need to do this, answer this question, is because it has significant implications for what is true about your faith. On the one hand, some people reject the Old Testament. They say, well, we shouldn't even have it. All you need is a pocket New Testament and you're good to go. Now, on your initial spiritual journey, I can agree with that. All you really need is the revelation of Jesus, because that's really all you need to know. But as you want to grow your faith and you want to see how the first century followers of Jesus proved that he was the Messiah, they used the Old Testament scriptures to do so. So what it does is it adds what I would call context, it adds nuance, it adds flavor, it adds a capacity to understand deeper the things that Christ said, because we have a deeper understanding of the Jewish culture, because Jesus was Jewish. And so that's why I think it's important to have the Old Testament and to read the Old Testament. On the other hand, people elevate the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, to the same value and level as the New Covenant in Jesus Christ. And that in and of itself creates a problem, because what it does is it in my opinion, is the greatest influence on becoming a legalistic person, a moralistic person, that kind of a Pharisaical Christian, if you can actually say that, because those are two words that really shouldn't be put together, so to speak, but they are. Nonetheless, it's kind of like a modern day Pharisee, but instead of in Judaism, it's in Christianity. So the reason why you need to answer the question of the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament for yourself, how they relate to each other, what are their roles in influencing one another, is because it has a huge impact on your faith. If you put too little on the Old Testament or too much on the Old Testament, what it does is it causes you to believe things about your faith that are false. Consequently, you must determine what you know and believe to be the proper relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, with that being said, I want to talk about, once you start to resolve that, you then begin to see, even in the Old Testament, the passages that point to Jesus. And then in the New Testament, the primary mission of Jesus was all about redemption. So our topic for the day is that the mission of every follower of Jesus should be redemption. The core of the ministry of Jesus and the foundation of what he accomplished through his death, burial, and resurrection has as a common theme and flavor throughout it all, redemption. Okay, that's what it is about. Therefore, if you want to follow Jesus, then I would encourage you to figure out what it means to participate in the mission of redemption. Now, how do you do that? Well, first and foremost, I would say you need to look at your own redemption. And that is once you begin to really understand the extent of the redemption of Jesus Christ in your life, you begin to really grow stronger in your faith. And what it does is, first and foremost, it gives you a understanding of how redemption works. Now, I've talked about this before, and I'll continue to do so, and that is that Paul tells the Philippians something really, really interesting in his book, or his letter to them, where he's talking about their salvation. And he talks about in the book of Philippians about salvation and the power of salvation and so forth. And he does something really interesting in chapter 2. Right after he talks about the supremacy of Jesus Christ, he goes, verse 12, "So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, because it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." Now, I really want this passage to sink in on you. He talks about the supremacy of Jesus, that he was united with God, that he emptied himself and took the form of a bondservant, and that he died on a cross, okay? And then God raised him from the dead. And what's interesting about that, then he goes on to say, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence. So he's saying you need to obey. Oftentimes when we hear the word obey, we get the notion, we assume, that there's a standard of behavior and we need to obey it. There are guidelines and we need to follow them. But the guidelines have to do with our behavior. I think we get this because of the way we raise children, and we got rebellion or obedience problem or whatever. In our school systems, it's always about, are they obedient children? In other words, do they follow the rules or not? But that's not what Paul's talking about here at all. And so if you misunderstand the essence of this word obey, then you'll bring into it kind of your own bias, and you'll misunderstand what he's saying. When he says, as you've always obeyed, not do so even more. And what are we to obey? Well, he says this, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. He's saying that the thing that you're doing is you are focusing yourself on your salvation. He says, I want you to work on it. I want you to do so with fear and trembling. And the word with fear in the Bible is not like, like we're scared and it's irrational. In the Bible, the word fear is often used to say a boatload of healthy respect. You have to say, wow, I need to do this. And if I don't get it right, there's going to be massive repercussions. Okay. And so that's what fear here, I think, means. He goes, do it with trembling, do it with a seriousness of heart that you've not ever done before. So the first thing I think that is so critically important for you as a follower of Christ is that you need to look deeply into your own redemption. Because then Paul says when you do that, he says, guess who's working in you right now? Guess what he's doing? He says, he's working in you for his good pleasure. So all the good things that God wants to do in you happen when you are working out your salvation in fear and trembling. And so I think that the first thing you have to do is be involved in the mission of redemption by knowing and understanding your own redemption. What did Christ save you from? Do you really know? Is it just from yourself, or is it from the world? Is it from sickness? I mean, what did Jesus Christ redeem you from? What was the purpose of his redemption, and what did he redeem you from? I think this is really important to understand because it gives you a inner sense of what's really going on in your relationship with Christ and why redemption is key. And the biggest thing it does is it brings so much healthiness to how you view your life. One of the problems that I talked with last week about moralism is that you come to Jesus under redemption, which is an act of humility. Then you start following moral guidelines and you put the trust in your morality to prove that you're a good Christian. And that does two things. It first and foremost gets rid of the humility that you had about your life. Number two, it closes you off. It introduces arrogance and pride into your relationship. But the biggest thing of all is it robs you of that passionate understanding and relationship with Jesus. Well, I can't tell you how many people that I knew over the course of 40 years of full-time ministry that would say, I've lost my passion for God. And I would always come back to the same point. Well, because you've turned your relationship with God into rule following. That's what you've done. You think, well, and so I think the issue is that redemption inculcates. It is the antidote to that happening in your journey with him because it brings a freshness back. It just brings a freshness back. It's interesting because one of the things that we do in our society that reminds us of this is whenever you get married, what do? You always celebrate your anniversary. If you don't celebrate your anniversary or you forget when it is, you're in big trouble. There's some big trouble going on there. But why do you celebrate your wedding anniversary if you're married? Why do you do that? Well, because you want to remember and honor and value the whole point and purpose of your marriage, and that is to love each other. That's why in a marriage ceremony, what do? You take vows, and those vows are critically important to the success and vibrancy of that relationship over time. Nobody looks at their marriage at their anniversary and goes, well, I was perfect last year. On the other hand, people say, well, I wasn't perfect, therefore I'm not married anymore, or I'm just a failure as a human being or a spouse. People generally don't do that. They go, well, we vowed to love each other through thick and thin. There was a little bit of thick and a whole lot of thin last year, but we are doing okay. Not because we're perfect, not because we have a perfect relationship, but because we have a vibrancy and passion that we renew every year in our love for one another. However, in the church and in your Christian journey, you get that message all the time, right? Well, you need to live up to the higher standard. And if you're not getting higher standards, and then it ends up comparing to other people. And it's just no wonder so many people are frustrated in their faith. No wonder there's so many people who've left the church or left faith. And I'm not saying what they did was right. And I'm not saying it's a good thing. All I'm saying is that I can kind of understand their position. And the reason why is because they never understood the vibrancy of an authentic relationship with Jesus. They saw Christianity as rule following. And when Christianity becomes rule following, guess what? You will never live up to it. It'll be the most frustrating thing you ever do in your life. And I want to save you from a frustrating faith. I want you to have a mature faith. And so you have to think critically for yourself. And that means a willingness to be completely honest with yourself and say, do I really understand what Christ redeemed me from? Boy, that'd be a great series to do a deep dive. The second thing I think that we have to do if we are going to participate in the ministry of redemption is that we have to look to the redemption of those around us. And this is really important. The people around you that don't know Jesus don't need to be saved. They need to be redeemed. Now, you might say, oh, you're splitting hairs there, Pastor. But I'm not. I'm really not. Because what we have done is we have used the word saved, salvation, in a way that miscommunicates what Christ has done in redemption for me as an individual. And that is that Christ is not coming in is an authority to demand that you follow this program. It's an invitation to be restored, to be redeemed, and to be healed. And so this is why pride is the worst sin of all. And the reason why pride is the worst sin of all is because people say, I don't need to be redeemed. I don't need to be restored. So what that person is saying is, I've never made a mistake. I have no regrets. I'm perfect. I believe that's the description of narcissism. And yet it runs rampant in our culture today. Redemption is an invitation. And it's really interesting when you compare Christianity that's really not, well, I'd like to say at its core, in its core tenets, it's not a religion. However, everybody in the world today pretty much experiences it as a religion. You can't go to Europe and not experience Christianity as a religion. It is. It's an institution. It's an organization. And in many ways, it's corrupt. You could go down to South America, and the Roman Catholic Church is a religion. It is an institution. And you can go anywhere in the world, and you're going to experience Christianity as a religion. And that, I think, is really unfortunate. That's why the Salty Pastor exists, is to get beyond the branding and get to the authentic, true, golden principles of actual faith. The other thing, too, is that you can be Catholic, you can be Eastern Orthodox, you can be charismatic, you can be a Presbyterian, Episcopalian. That doesn't matter. You can listen to Salty Pastor and your faith will grow. Because the key element in faith is that you are redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ shed on the cross, right? And then he raised from the dead. Consequently, since redemption is an invitation, there is a key doctrine, and that is the doctrine of non-coercion. This is a different doctrine. It's unlike Islam. It's unlike Buddhism, Hinduism, atheism, scientific materialism. All of these belief systems, secular humanism included, have a doctrine of coercion. What do I mean by that? Well, in Islam, they basically coerce you because they call you an infidel. They're going to kill you and wipe you out if you don't convert. So that tends to motivate a lot of people to convert. But then the next thing they do is that even if they say, well, we're going to allow you to be a Christian or maybe a Jew, that's all they'll allow but that you have to pay an extra tax called the jizya. So that is coercive in and of itself. If you look at Buddhism, if you look at Hinduism, they are very coercive. Hinduism forces a caste system on people, and it's very coercive. You cannot marry out of your caste. Even today in India, you cannot do that. A lot of people would say, well, then we need more secularism because religions are so coercive. Really? You're going to try to make that case. If people believe that, they're ignorant of history, because atheism, scientific materialism, secularism are even more coercive than Islam. It's unbelievable how coercive they are. You look at communist Russia, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. These things were driven by atheism. At their core, Karl Marx's philosophy is atheistic. Communism is simply the expression of a belief in there is no God. That's what it is. So to say that they're two different things is just intellectually ignorant. If you want to try to argue, you got to pick a better argument, because that one is just like stinky poo-poo guts. I mean, it's just not good. And so atheism, scientific materialism are coercive. We get that in the teaching of evolution in our public school system. It's extremely coercive. It says, first and foremost, we refuse to acknowledge any other alternative viewpoint in our teaching. Number two, if you hold it out of an alternative viewpoint, guess what? You're an ignorant rube who is going to destroy the world with their stupidity. That's extremely coercive in their approach. So it's so unlike Christianity because at its core, Christianity believes in the doctrine of non-coercion. When you go back and read the New Testament, he's like, look, we can't force this. We don't force people to believe. We pray that the Holy Spirit, as Jesus said, comes and convicts the world of its sin. What does that mean? It convicts the world that it needs to be redeemed. I need to be redeemed because I have things in my life that I need to be redeemed from. I need to be redeemed from portions of myself. So redemption is a big deal in Christianity, but it's an invitation. Whereas in Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, atheism, scientific materialism, secular humanism, it's not an invitation at all. It's all about coercion. So when you seek to try to redeem those around you, remember, at its core, it's always an invitation and nothing else. Once you do that, then you can start to look at redeeming our culture and redeeming our nation. We can redeem our culture. And the interesting thing about it is that we have been told as followers of Christ that we have lost the culture. We have lost the cultural war, and that fewer and fewer people are Christians. And I pointed out the data that Christianity will be a minority by 2070. So in, I don't know, what is that, 45 years, 44 years, something like that? Well, basically one generation. So babies born today, by the time they're in their midlife crisis, all Christianity in America there'll be a minority. Well, that's if things continue to go in the direction they're going. And that is at its core, do we believe that God not only redeems individuals, but he also redeems families, and he redeems cultures, and he redeems society? Now, this is where we have to ask that question about the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? And that is, are there any examples in the Old Testament of people who were non-Jewish and their society was going off the cliff and God redeemed them? Yes, there are. Are there examples of societies that had gone off the cliff that God says, I'm not going to redeem it, and he destroys it? Yes, there is. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that God, in his divine sovereignty, understands what's going on in those cultures better than anybody else. And in his judgment, he allows some to be redeemed and others to be destroyed. Now, do we know the basis of all of that? No, we can surmise and try to glean some wisdom or knowledge about why that decision was made. But we also have to have a healthy form of humility and respect where God says, your thoughts are not my thoughts. In other words, how can you fathom? He tells Job this. How could you even fathom the way I think or what I was doing or thinking when I created the heavens and the stars? He goes, you can't. Your brain is just way too small to even fathom my thoughts and why I do things. So we got to have a healthy respect when we're asking, okay, what was the difference? But we're not trying to say, oh, that is the model that God uses, and once our society becomes like Sodom and Gomorrah or becomes like Nineveh, where are we at? How are we going? Well, okay, now what you've done is you've elevated the Old Testament and its significance too high. You see, because you're saying that, okay, that's going to be the judgment. No, Jesus says, I came to be a fulfillment and to do something that the Old Testament, the Old Covenant could never do, and that is redeem people and return them to God. Consequently, our first goal should be, how do we redeem culture and how do we redeem nation? Because if God allowed redemption of cultures and societies in the Old Testament, then you know for a fact through the power of Jesus Christ, it's possible. 100% possible. We can do it. But the real question is, what is our strategy? Are we using an Old Testament strategy, which a lot of people do? Like Nineveh was what? It was redeemed. Why? Because they sent a prophet. Yes, they did. The prophet, the guy, Jonah got thrown into the whale, in the belly of the whale. He goes there and he tells them, you're all going to burn. You're all going to be destroyed unless you turn to God. And then they go, okay, yeah, you're probably right. And they turn back to God. And then the prophet Jonah was what? He was mad that they repented. I mean, he was mad that they repented. And if we use that model of Old Testament prophetic utterance to try to redeem the culture, guess what? It's not going to work. If we use a coercive doctrine, it's not going to work. And you see little smidgens of this. It's not very big. A lot, the left loves to demonize this. They call it Christian nationalism. And then they throw anybody who believes in God into their category of Christian nationalism, which is pretty crazy if you ask me. But what they're doing is there's a doctrinal position called dominion theology. And in Christianity, dominion theology means that Christians were to have dominion over the world here on earth. And it's a part of their eschatology. Eschatology is study of the end times and some other things, and covenantal theology and these types of things. It's not a big group. You hear about it in Idaho because up in Moscow, there's a church with a little Bible college associated with it that are dominion theologians, and they try to propagate that quite often. And so why am I bringing that up? Well, because those are approaches and methodologies based on an Old Testament strategy, not a New Testament strategy, which is redemption. So we have to ask, what strategy are we using and how is it working? And what methods do we need to change? And first and foremost, I would say we need to start preaching again, because mostly what we do in our churches is teach, right? So many people go, hey, man, I want you to go verse by verse through the Bible, and I want you to tell me what these verses mean. That's valuable, but that's not preaching. That's teaching. So what we do is we have people who have a lot of knowledge about the Bible. But what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians? That knowledge does what? It puffs you up, whereas love builds you up. Preaching is different. In the New Testament, it has two different words for that. The word for teaching is didaskalos, and it means to give over. And then the word for preaching is keruso. And that is it's a proclamation. And it doesn't mean standing on a street corner with a bullhorn like the prophet that went to Nineveh and told them they're all going to burn in hell, right? That's not what preaching is. If you look in Acts, there's an example called Mars Hill where Paul goes to Athens and he goes and then he does a persuasive dialogue with the current philosophers to present the gospel. And I believe that at its core is the greatest method and strategy that we can use. We have to preach more, and that means engage the culture and being honest with the culture. Now, another thing, though, that we have to do is we have to be much more civically minded. One of the biggest issues that we have today, why we lose the culture, is because we are civically ignorant of the founding of our country. There's an article out by, I don't know, this was the Populous Times or something like that. Anyway, what happened is Justice Neil Gorsuch, did I say that? Or Gorsuch of the Supreme Court. So he's one of the Supreme Court justices. He just wrote a book for kids called The Heroes of 1776. And they said, well, why are you doing this? He goes, well, a lack of basic knowledge about the nation's founding principles represents a serious threat to our country. Gorsuch then cites Thomas Jefferson's view of civic ignorance. He says, Thomas Jefferson said, an ignorant people will never remain free for long. And Gorsuch adds, he is right. Well, we have to be civically minded, and we have to be aware that one of the things that's happening is our government has grown so big and so large and it has been overrun by people who have an ideology that seeks to eradicate Christianity in order that it can impose its new, sense of revolution or whatever may be the case. People say, wow, that sounds really conspiratorial, Pastor. I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist. I'm just simply saying that many of our organizations and institutions today have been taken over by people who do not hold what Neil Gorsuch would call a classic civic-minded understanding of our nation. He goes on to say this. He goes, Neil Gorsuch says this. He goes, this Constitution established the first modern republic in which people rule themselves. He says there are three radical ideas, super radical. He said, number one, we're all created equal, that we have unalienable rights that come from God, not government. And then finally, the people have a right to govern themselves. Well, people who are taking over our institutions today don't believe in those values at all. And if we are not diligent and more civic-minded, we are going to allow it to happen. Case in point, one of the main ways in which this has happened is the American Society, the Association of School Counselors Association. Did I say that right? Okay, I'm going to go look up the exact term so that I get it straight because I want you to understand, okay? American School Counselors Association. And now I can't speak for every state out there, but just as an example, the ASCA is the most influential force in American school, public school counseling profession. It was founded in 1952 in Alexandria, Virginia. It now operates as a nonprofit organization and it has 43,000 members, and it has established divisions in all 50 states. If you go to their website, you see that they exist to support school counselors' efforts to help students focus on academic, career, and social emotional development. Okay, that last one is critical to know. Social emotional development. It also then provides publications, resources, research, and advocacy to school counselors around the globe. Also, it is primarily known for the national model. It is a comprehensive framework of policies and procedures that defines the role of school counselors and guides their practice in schools across the country. And if you look at what they do, even here in Idaho, their primary goal is to define the role and purpose of the school counseling program, and they want to advance some of the most radical ideology that you can understand, particularly, right? They want equitable participation in outcomes and educational programs wherein disproportionately exists regarding enrollment in such programs by race, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, language, immigration status, juvenile justice court involvement. So they say right here that their primary goal is to help students in the issue of gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration status, and so forth. If you go on, I believe I have a little passage here that I have highlighted. I want to pull it up if I can find it. I may have, here it is. It says, lest there be any skepticism over whether the ASCA's influence pushes counselors in an ideologically leftward direction, an ASCA survey of its members makes it clear. 86% of respondents affirmed that school counselors, school counseling candidates must be able to accept and affirm a student of any sexuality, even if they do not affirm or approve of their behavior. It says that they are to circumvent parents. I mean, it just goes on and on. Now, I believe that so much of this craziness that you see, boys being in girls' bathrooms, even here in Idaho, are because of the ideology that was introduced into the school through the ASCA and the school counseling staff. And people are like, wow, that's crazy. I'm so glad it doesn't happen here in Idaho. I don't know if you know this, but the West Ada School District here in the Treasure Valley has adopted the ASCA's overall model. It's been adopted in Coeur d'Alene as well. And that's why we have some of this craziness going on. The only way that we'll ever be able to overcome it is if we, as followers of Christ, are more civic-minded. And I know that's hard to do, but it can be done. And the biggest thing to do is start to wean yourself off of constant entertainment, focus on what Christ redeemed you from, and then spend 10 minutes a day becoming knowledgeable on what's happening in your particular neck of the woods, your little corner of Idaho or Utah or Seattle or Arizona or wherever you're at, because you have to be civically minded if we want to continue to be able to redeem this culture. Now, I know I went a little long today. Had a lot to say, but I hope that you found it beneficial. Remember, go over to our website and click on that join the email list button. If you're there and you want to make a donation to this ministry, we are 100% listener supported, and we appreciate all that you do. Remember, what you believe is one of the most important things about you.